So Peter Pan's Neverland Nightmare is the third installment in a or the TCU. It's the first one not called Winnie the Pooh Blood and Honey, and the first not written or directed by Rhys Frake Waterfield. Instead, we have writer and director Scott Chambers, who actually starred in Winnie the Pooh Blood and Honey 2 as Christopher Robin, but is actually a fairly legit actor with some promise. Yeah, he's been in some stinkage, but he played a young Ian McKellen alongside actual Ian McKellen. He starred in Joe Stevenson's 2015 movie Chicken, and he even featured in Simon Amstell's short film Carnage. But instead of pursuing a legit career in acting, he's become the mind behind such classics as Firenado, The Curse of Humpty Dumpty, and of course, who could forget Kingdom of the Dinosaurs. But now to this contemporary classic. Notably, this film stars basically nobody you will have heard of. They've only ever been in these kinds of movies pretty much, and they're all going to be connected to the Poohniverse in some way going forward. But I have to point out, this movie features Nicholas Wooderson as Stephen, who is like a legit actor. Look at this resume. Oh, and this film's version of Captain Hook is played by a guy called Charity Case, and I think I just needed to put that out there. So the premise for this masterpiece is that Peter Pan worked in a circus as a mime, and instead of being magic, in this he's a sort of Pied Piper figure who sells kids on the idea of Neverland and takes them away to be killed. However, when his target becomes young Michael, his sister Wendy tries to save him. It's a simple enough premise. And the film opens up on this weirdly visually interesting narration, similar to Blood and Honey, but this time talking about Neverland, how it was a paradise for the boys there who never grew up. They had their every desire granted by fairies, and there were no parents. It's heaven. And this opening narration is done by our titular Peter Pan, played by Martin Portlock, who actually has a really good voice for this intro. We then get into another intro sequence where Peter tries to abduct a 13-year-old boy named James, but is met with a fair bit of resistance from James's mom. Peter eventually wins the struggle, but not before James's mother mutilates Peter's face. The gore is actually quite well done. The problem being the movie is just shot like complete shit. At least the horror scenes are. Anything that takes place during the night absolutely stinks, and I understand the budget for these is quite low, but there are so many movies made for far less than this, especially in horror like The Blair Witch Project, Paranormal Activity, Creep, and I mean, you could have made 250 Eraserheads with this budget. And I'm aware not everyone is David Lynch or even Patrick Bright, but I do feel like a good creative vision can flourish with a $250,000 budget, especially something like this. A lot of what could instantly bump this film's quality up are things that come relatively cheap, like good and effective lighting. You just need to hire someone creative and competent. You don't even need a better cast. What we have is pretty decent. I understand I said nobody in this is notable, but I meant that more in terms of a resume. Martin Portlock's vocal performance feels very informed by Heath Ledger's Joker, which is a cheap bit. It's a lazy place to draw inspiration from, even lazier to just imitate, but it works enough, and with his makeup and physical performance, he can be very effective at times. Peter D'Souza Faney of the Pub's Exorcist fame plays Michael and is a great child actor in horror and deserves to be in more than the fucking TCU. And top of the list, Megan Placido, who plays the film's other protagonist, Wendy, is so good. She's far better than any of these movies deserve. She's slated to be in a real movie later this year called The Salt Path with Gillian Anderson and Jason Isaacs, and I hope she does end up having a good career, because from this alone, she's far more competent than pretty much anyone else near her. Tinkerbell in this movie is a trans heroin addict who is convinced she is addicted to pixie dust, or maybe she knows it's heroin. Nobody actually really knows. They don't explain much in this movie. She kind of helps Peter abduct and keep these kids before he sends them to so-called Neverland. She's played by Kit Green, a real trans actor, and they are maybe the strongest performer aside from Placido, but isn't given nearly enough material to make it anything worth writing home about. Now, I'm not going to run through the whole story and script because there's plenty of channels that can do that, but there's a few things I do want to point out, like this one little moment where Peter is having a sort of weird vision and imagines himself flying. It's a really interesting moment conceptually, signifying that he's closer to death himself, maybe edging closer to Neverland, which is why he's killing so many children before he goes. Even Michael comments to Tinkerbell on how he's clearly ill. But this could also just be him thinking about how he sees himself. It's never quite clear whether Peter knows he's a serial killer and he's just doing what he does, or actually believes in his own myth and thinks he's actually taking these kids to Neverland. Usually in a horror movie, something like that would be intriguing. Ambiguity of the villain's mental state and motivations is sometimes an interesting lead to keep the audiences on. It keeps them watching to solve that puzzle. But this movie doesn't really present it in any interesting way, and it doesn't even seem like it knows that's part of the film's makeup, so it ultimately just feels like messy and indecisive writing. And I know how silly I sound trying to authentically analyze Peter Pan's Neverland Nightmare, the third installment in the big TCU, but the film is noticeably trying at a lot of points to be artistically viable and a good movie. It isn't like a movie such as Sharknado or The Velocipaster that knows it's a piece of shit and is just trying to be at least an entertaining and funny piece of shit. This movie does at times want to be taken seriously, therefore I have to treat it that way. And for what it's worth, it isn't completely without merit. Anyway, in the story, Peter kidnaps Michael, everyone is worried, Wendy hunts for him, Peter kills a bus full of children, he abducts Michael's best friend, as well as killing his family. We find out that Peter is literally cockless, presumably mutilated by his mother, or at least that's what I think the idea is, and despite being engulfed by her Stockholm syndrome, Tinkerbell helps Wendy save Michael. This happens because Wendy figures out Tinkerbell is actually Timmy, Peter's first victim. And there's a bunch of random scenes and happenings. Tinkerbell stands up for herself and gets her limbs lobbed off and killed. Wendy finds Joey, who's Michael's best friend, and gets him out. Wendy finds James, the kid from the intro, who is now chained in the basement, now with a hook for a hand. Do you see where that's going? Wendy fights Peter, blah blah blah, none of it really matters, none of it really works. But I do find it interesting how Peter allows only 2 of his victims ever to live. Timmy, who turns into Tinkerbell and is allowed to live maybe because he's the first victim and Peter wants help with the next ones, maybe? I don't know. And also James, who is allowed to live maybe because his mother is the one who mutilates Peter's face and he wants James to suffer for that. Either way, they don't really delve into any of that either, so it's all wasted speculation anyway. It just feels like the movie itself is so uninterested with the only things that make it interesting. Anyway, to wrap up, there's more fighting, more gore, Peter gets dragged away by Hook, and then we get a cliffhanger ending because of course Peter Pan can't die, we need him for the Poohniverse. Now I wish they dived more deeply into Peter's backstory. We get fragments like how he had an awful mother and childhood, then a long time after he worked in some kind of fantasy themed circus somehow, and then 15 years after that to now where all this takes place. But it all just paints a hazy picture that fails our antagonist. He's not ambiguous enough to be mysterious and leave the audience craving more, and he isn't developed enough to be a well-written character that an audience can invest time in unpacking. Which is a shame because he's a horror villain that has potential, unlike the others in this universe so far, but unfortunately the seeds we get never truly sprout into anything substantial. And it's not like they didn't have time, they waste a fair bit of the first act setting up this relationship drama for Wendy that goes absolutely nowhere and serves no purpose for the script. It doesn't reveal anything about Wendy that's useful, nor does it make us care for her in any significant way because it's not developed enough, and it's not fun enough to be worthwhile in just a pure entertainment space. It's a complete waste of time, and time that could be better spent fleshing out the guy this whole movie exists around. A lot of this feels like the Terrifying movies, with a lot less interesting villain of course and a lot less impressive gore, but in the fashion that we have a solid lead actress with a solid younger brother companion who work together to defeat the serial killer in a low budget gore show. The difference is that to me, Art the Clown works for so many people because we know absolutely nothing about him. He has a great design and a great performer with absolutely nothing behind him. That mystery intrigues people, whether he's supernatural or not, intrigues people. The sibling dynamic in the Terrifier sequels is what holds them together. They have decent performers who are written strangely well, and their chemistry really sells their dynamic. The problem is that this film tries to have those things too, but just doesn't do any of it nearly as well, and I don't even love the Terrifier movies. And don't get me wrong, this film is nowhere near outright awful. It's surprisingly quite okay at times, but the overall product of what all of this is an underwhelming waste of potential and money. It won't win any awards for being good and isn't awful enough to win any awards for being bad, but it is an improvement on the previous 2 TCU movies, so maybe by the time we get to Poohniverse Monsters Assemble we'll actually have a good movie. Okay, maybe not, but that's just me. What do you think? Have you seen Peter Pan's Neverland Nightmare? If so, let me know what you thought. If not, will you? And whether it's an installment in the Poohniverse or not. As always, keep watching movies.